Good morning. Welcome to Yosemite Valley. My name is Shelton Johnson. When most Americans think of African Americans and national park history, they usually think of notable figures such as Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington, or most recently, Harriet Tubman. But they don't normally think of wild places like Yosemite. They think of urban environments, they think of rural environments, but not a wilderness. And Yosemite is very much a wilderness. But Yosemite also houses some great stories involving African Americans. During the gold rush, there were African Americans in the foothills of the Sierra who were panning for gold, trying to strike it rich just like everyone else, but they had other things to purchase, such as their own freedom, potentially. You have African Americans serving here as stage drivers, and in particular, I'm thinking of George Monroe, who worked for the Washburn brothers and actually drove in different presidents into Yosemite National Park. And then during the New Deal, under Franklin Roosevelt, there were African Americans who worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps right here in Yosemite Valley, repairing and building infrastructure in Yosemite. But the most important story, not that those other stories aren't important, but the most important would involve the Buffalo Soldiers. These were African American cavalry and infantry troops who served as some of the first park rangers right here in Yosemite as well as Sequoia National Park. Here in Yosemite, they built trails. They were responsible for building the first nature trail or first museum in the national park system on the South Fork of the Merced River in the area known as Wawona. And it was just something pretty simple in design. It was just a trail along the South Fork of the Merced with plants labeled in both English and Latin, but it's considered today to be the first museum in the national park system. And then in Sequoia National Park, in 1903, the Buffalo Soldiers built the first usable wagon road into Sequoia's giant forest, the most famous grove of giant sequoia in the world. So with those contributions, you think they would have been remembered, but they were forgotten. And so for quite a few years now, myself and my predecessors have brought that story back. That story is now known nationwide and even around the world to some degree. And the key thing that I always try to communicate is that their presence allowed for a greater window to be open for African Americans and other communities of color to see themselves reflected in that window and to look into that history and see themselves present. And that's a very powerful thing if you grow up in an urban environment, an inner city, and national parks are, to you, someplace that does not have your fingerprint. Your psyche is not part of that landscape. So when you know these stories, they lend themselves to you feeling more rooted in places that you thought were foreign. And that's a very powerful thing. And so when I'm here in Yosemite, I'm always thinking about my predecessors, the Buffalo Soldiers who built those trails, who patrolled the high country, who made certain that the poaching was limited, who made certain that people were safe, who basically created a presence of law and order in a lawless West. That's a very powerful thing and a very powerful contribution to our national parks and to American history. So if you get to Yosemite, you get to Sequoia, ask about the Buffalo Soldiers, ask about some of the first park rangers, and then when you see a ranger and he or she is wearing a hat like this, that's where this hat came from. It came from the campaign hat that was worn by the cavalry troops who were here, the cavalry hat that was worn by the Buffalo Soldiers.
Greetings, fellow citizens. I am yours truly, Frederick Douglass. I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the eastern shore in Talbot County near St. Michael's, along the Tuckahoe River. Of course, I do not know the date of my birth, as slaves did not know the dates of their births. The closest we could come would be planting time, harvest time, cherry time. If you are familiar with my narrative, then you might know that I escaped from slavery from Baltimore, and I fled to England and Ireland, where I stayed around 21 months, and I came back a free man. Julia Griffiths, the Richardson family, raised money to purchase my freedom, another $2,500 to help me finance my newspaper, the North Star newspaper. And I moved my family from Lynn, Massachusetts to Rochester. And here is where the peculiar situation occurred that I would become involved in in the suffrage movement. And I suppose that's why I'm invited here today. You all are celebrating the centennial of the woman's right to vote. And I was involved in the suffrage movement, universal suffrage, fighting for the rights of women and for the abolition of slavery. And so we're going to have a little talk about that time and what minor things I contributed to the cause of women. Of course, it was my idea, of course, with my newspaper that I would support the rights of women. My mantra for the North Star was, right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Now, of course, I went through so many things in my time as a slave. I was very fortunate with a divine providence that I ended up in Baltimore, living with my master's cousins, Mr. Hugh and Sophia All, and they, Mrs. All, shared some ABCs with me, and I was able to teach myself how to read and write, and I escaped. Now, while I'm in England, there are some other dynamics going on that a woman by the name of Mr. Cresha Mott and a young woman around my age, Miss Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were attending the World Anti-Slavery Conference in New York, in England. And these women were used to having their say, unlike most women of the day. And while they were at that conference, that convention, they were not permitted to speak. And so Mrs. Mott, who was a fiery woman, made it known in the streets of London that she should be heard, and her demands for equal rights should be heard. The newspapers caught wind of this, and they wrote articles, and by the time they arrived back in America, they were, or she was dubbed, the Lioness of London. Now, how we all converge in this utopia, so to speak, of Rochester, New York, upstate New York, is probably a divine providence. There were forces that were working that put us together at that particular time. I do know from the history that these women had been fighting for their suffrage for quite some time. Mrs. Mott in Philadelphia, Mrs. Stanton, understanding that she had talents beyond just being a normal housekeeper and mother, that she had skills as a writer and a lawyer. There were many other women, like the Grimke sisters, who saw the injustices in society and saw that they understood that they did not have equal rights. I believe predominantly they got this idea when they were able to see the Native Americans from the Iroquois Nation. This was 6 nations of Indians that made a peace treaty. The Halasequia population. And when they saw the matriarchs of that community making decisions, governing even, when they saw that these women did not just have privileges bestowed by them by the men of the Iroquois Nation, that they actually had rights, that they understood how much they were disenfranchised. And so from learning from these Native American women, they decided we should draft some document to express our sentiments about our disenfranchisement. And so it wasn't long before while I was in Rochester, New York, that I got a telegram from Waterloo. It seems that Mrs. Mott and Mrs. Stanton had gotten together with some other women there, and they had decided to draft a declaration of sentiments, as they called it. This was basically their Declaration of Independence from the cruelty of the situation they were in as women, not being able to own land, run a business, attend school even. Their property belonged basically to their husbands. Even their children did not belong to them. They birthed them, but they, if at a husband's whim, he could take all their properties, their clothing, their children, and leave them barren. And so they sent me this telegram saying, not only are we going to open this letter of our sentiments for equal rights, we're going to hold our first National Women's Convention. Now, this was around July 19th and 20th, so to speak, of 1848. And they invited me to come and be the master of ceremony. Well, these women were moving very quickly. I hardly had time to even put an announcement of this convention in my newspaper, but I made haste and came down to Seneca Falls in that year of 1848, and there gathered were hundreds of people in the chapel where these women stood up and stated their declaration of sentiments. And I was proud to be a part of this movement. And I gave a speech that day. I spoke on behalf of the women. There were about 36 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments, including myself. I was the only black man who signed. I'd like to give you just a sampling of that speech. I do know that the time is limited here in this format that we are in, and the speeches that we gave in the period were quite lengthy. But nevertheless, I will indulge you to have a little sampling of what I said to the women and men gathered there that day. And now, I assure you that all the men there were not there to compliment the women. Some of them were there to ridicule and mock them for having the audacity to demand equal rights. But what I said, basically, to the women was this: Mrs. President, ladies and gentlemen, I come to this platform with unusual diffidence. Although I have been long identified by the woman suffrage movement and have often spoken in its favor, I am at somewhat of a loss to know what to say on this really great and uncommon occasion where so much has been said. When I look around on this assembly and I see the many able and eloquent women full of subject and ready to speak, I would not now speak but for my early connection with the cause and having been called to do so by this council. Men have a little business here as speakers, and if they come here at all, they should take the backbenches and wrap themselves in silence. For this is an international council, not for men, but for women, and woman should have all there is to say in it. This is her day in court. I've heard many men speak on this subject, some of them the most eloquent to be found anywhere in the country. But I believe no man, however gifted in thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of woman with the skill and effect, with the power and authority of woman herself. He can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of the way and give her the opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality. Her right to do and to be is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth. I say to her, as I say to the colored people, give her fair play and hands off. There may be some well-meaning people in this audience who have never read a woman's suffrage newspaper, never heard a woman's suffrage speech, never attended a woman's suffrage conference. And they may be surprised that those who speak here do not argue the question. The demand of the hour is not argument, but assertion, firm and inflexible assertion which has more power than the force of an argument. If there is any argument to be made, it should be made by the opponents, not by the friends of the woman's suffrage. They will find not one reason, not one consideration that can be urged supporting the right of women to vote that does not equally support the right of men and women to vote. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. Time itself is a very conservative power. That what is, always was, and always will be, world without end. We have heard this old argument before, ladies, and if you live very long, you shall hear it again. Man has become so accustomed to command and woman to obey that both parties in the relationship have hardened into their respective places and thus has piled up a mountain of iron against woman's enfranchisement. Such a truth is woman's right to equal liberty with man. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it, and no custom, law, or usage can ever destroy it. So the women who have thus far caused this agitation have already embodied Theodore Parker's 3 grades of human greatness. First is greatness in executive and administrative ability. Secondly, greatness in the ability to organize. And thirdly, in the ability to discover truth. They are seen in the order which has characterized the proceedings of this conference. They are seen in the steady growth of the movement, not only in this country, but around the world. And they are heard whenever the mantra is read out loud. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Yeah, so this speech was warmly received. And of course, we went on to fight for the rights of women. It was not an automatic thing. But one thing we did understand is that the Constitution is not a dead letter. This Constitution, drafted by our forefathers, was a document that gives us the rights to address our grievances in a marketplace, and that's what we did in the chapel in Seneca Falls. And then to go on to ask for legislation to give women the rights they deserve, not just privileges, but the rights that they were born with. And so we continue to fight for that cause. Of course, we adopted the mantra of universal suffrage. And so as I traveled the country and spoke to anti-slavery conventions, both black and white, I always brought up the issue of what about the women? What about these women? What about not only women, black women who were enslaved, but white women who were disenfranchised, the masterless slaves? And so frequently I was met with pushback. I was, well, they didn't want the women to speak. I would bring women to the convention with me who were talented speakers, Sojourner Truth, Frances E.W. Harper. She was a wonderful poet and abolitionist. She could speak with great vigor and sincerity, but in many cases the men would not listen. And so as we moved close, and we had already achieved the 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment. When it got to the 15th Amendment, unfortunately, the country was not ready for the woman vote. All that I could do was to stand and say, make a decision on whether I would go through this window of opportunity or I would stay with my sisters. Well, I felt like it was an opportunity for us to move forward in some manner, and hopefully that the women would come through that window of opportunity sooner rather than later. What happened, unfortunately, once women were given the right to vote, men were given the right to vote, that these ladies who I had been working with, Susan B. Anthony, who had gotten herself arrested for the cause of getting the vote, that she and others were very upset. They were very disappointed. And so what we experienced was a time where we were at odds with each other. The newspapers took the opportunity to take advantage of the cracks in the foundation of our relationship. There were things said in the newspapers that none of us were proud of, and of course, some things directed at me, which I was disappointed at, but not necessarily surprised. I understood that these women of the suffrage movement, Mrs. Stanton, the Grimke sisters, all of them had a different economic status in America, unlike my wife, Anna Murray, unlike Tubman and Mrs. Truth. They had some social status that was above them. And so there were some, as far as our character, some things that were, well, not very pleasant. It was unfortunate that during that time, so much momentum was lost in that window of opportunity that women would be able to get the right to vote. We struggled for years. I never saw the woman's right to vote come along. I do remember that the women, after a couple of decades, I remember it was the late 1890s that they had started to build some force and some momentum, and I started attending some of the conferences they had, and they came to Washington, D.C., where I was living at the time, and I came to support them. And I met with the sisters that I had fought with back in the 40s, and we reconciled, and we looked forward. I believe it was Mrs. Stanton, or it might have been Miss Anthony that said, failure is not an option. And so they kept on fighting for the cause of women's rights and the woman right to vote. Now, as I understand it in reading, and I've only been here for a short time, that you women did get the right to vote. Well, that's a grand thing. Now that you have your right to vote, you should certainly be continuing to agitate to improve on your rights, as we understand that the Constitution is not a dead letter. Just as it happened to the black man after the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction. We got the right to vote, but then those who thought that it was an injustice to them, they started lobbying in the marketplace, they started protesting, they started trying to infiltrate, and they pushed back. And they ended up disenfranchising the black man in some considerable ways. We basically lost our right to vote by taxes and laws and all sorts of obstacles built up around the 15th Amendment that would keep us from fully enfranchising our right to vote. So that's just where it might be, where you might find yourself today. If you have the right to vote, you have to be continually agitating for the right to vote. You should still be exercising your civic responsibility. It does not stop at the ballot box. Once you go into the ballot box and you come out, well, then you still have to continue to follow the footsteps of your elected officials to make sure that they are representing you properly, that they are not taking a bribe from the other side, that you might be disenfranchised. This is the living document we've been given called this U.S. Constitution. Some people say that it's a flawed document. Well, I'm a black man who can read, and I believe that although some of the founders were actually slaveholders, they set a great ideal. And so we should be trying to follow that ideal. And as the great Sidney Smith said, we should not be resting on the laurels of on the work of our forefathers. Men, as this is Sidney Smith talking, Men seldom eulogize the virtue and fame of their fathers without avoiding some folly or wickedness of their own. We cannot live on the work of our fathers without setting some example or doing the work that will set up a future for our children. And so that is a challenge to all of you as you go forward, as you celebrate this centennial of a woman's right to vote, is to keep on agitating for full enfranchisement in American society, the right to equal pay, the right to any number of issues that might be facing you in this modern era. Be like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Be like Miss Lucretia Mott. Be like Miss Susan B. Anthony. Be like Sojourner Truth. Stand for justice. Follow in their footsteps. Teach your children, your daughters, that they have certain inalienable rights. And the privilege is less than a right. When you have rights, then they are guaranteed you, and you should be able to exercise those rights and follow life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, thank you for the time talking to you today. Excuse the situation. This modern era seems to have, what I understand, a pandemic going on. The air is somewhat troublesome. I should have had a glass of water. But nevertheless, take care of yourselves. We had certainly had the yellow fever and scarlet fever that was plaguing our communities at our time. Certainly we did not have the medicine that you all had to be able to deal with sicknesses and such. So take care of yourselves, take care of your families, take care of your communities, and take care of your country. I am yours truly, Frederick Douglass.